The night air around the camp was heavy with tension, the kind on every soldier's chest as they prepared for a mission most of them secretly believed would fail, and at the center of that suffocating atmosphere stood Lieutenant Commander Elena Hayes, the only woman ever assigned to lead an operational SEAL team into enemy territory, her dark hair tucked beneath her helmet and her eyes sharp with a determination that many of her fellow operators could not yet trust, because for months since her appointment circulated through the barracks and briefing rooms, doubts voiced behind closed doors and smirks exchanged when she passed by, doubts that she could carry the weight of the title she had earned through years of grueling training, relentless endurance, and an iron will that refused to break even when her body screamed for mercy. And now, in this desert far from home, those doubts were about to be tested in a way no exercise could have prepared them for, because intelligence had come in just hours earlier that a fortified compound deep in enemy-controlled territory was housing not only a weapons cache large enough to supply an insurgent battalion but also 15 of the most dangerous and elusive commanders who had orchestrated countless ambushes, bombings, and civilian massacres over the past year, men who moved like shadows and vanished before airstrikes could catch them, men who the CIA had failed to pin down for months, and now, against all odds, those men were together under one roof, vulnerable but guarded by a network of fighters so ruthless that even the seasoned veterans in Elena's team wondered aloud whether this was suicide disguised as a mission. Yet Elena had not flinched when the order was handed to her. She had not hesitated when her superiors questioned whether she was the right one to lead. She simply looked them in the eye and said in a voice as calm as steel, "Give me the target and I'll give you results," though inside she could feel the enormity of what lay ahead pressing against her ribs like a weight threatening to crack her bones. But she swallowed that fear and transformed it into focus, because fear had no place in the moments before war, and as she stood now with her team crouched around a flickering red light map table, she gave orders with such clarity that even the doubters paused, hearing in her tone not the desperation of someone trying to prove herself but the authority of someone who knew exactly what had to be done, for she had studied the terrain for hours, escape timings and fallback plans with a precision that left no room for hesitation, and while some of the men still thought of her as an outsider wearing their trident, in that moment her leadership wrapped around them like a shield, steadying their nerves and aligning their scattered doubts into a razor's edge of focus, and though no one said it aloud, each of them understood that within the next hour their lives would depend not on rank or history or tradition but on the instincts and courage of the woman they had once dismissed as a token commander, yet who now prepared to lead them into the kind of storm that could either etch their names in the legends of warfare or bury them in unmarked graves beneath the foreign sand that as the blacked-out helicopters lifted them into the sky. Blades roaring against the desert night, Elena sat silent among her team, her weapon cradled across her chest, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the open bay door where the sandstorm winds were of danger. And though her body was still, her mind raced through every detail of the operation, rehearsing the breach points, the timing of charges, the angles of fire, and the countless contingencies she had plotted for, because she knew the margin for error was thinner than the edge of a blade, and any hesitation would cost lives, perhaps the mission itself. And while the men around her sat in their gear, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of what they were about to attempt, she could feel their glances on her, some skeptical, some grudgingly respectful, but all silently questioning if she would falter when the first shots cracked through the night. Yet Elena refused to let those doubts into her own bloodstream, for she had faced a lifetime of skepticism before ever setting foot in combat boots, and each time she had answered with results that silenced her critics, so this night would be no different, and as the pilot's voice broke through the headset announcing 2 minutes to drop, Elena gave the signal, her hand one last time, reminding them of sectors, fallback codes, and the importance of moving like shadows, fast and silent, striking only when the signal was given, and the men nodded, their discipline tightening around them like armor, because no matter their personal doubts, they knew the chain of command was sacred, and in that moment she was the chain that held them together. So when the ropes dropped and boots hit the sand, the silence of their descent was broken only by the hiss of shifting grains beneath combat saws, and the world narrowed into darkness and purpose, each step bringing them closer to the compound where enemies slept unaware that death was already moving toward them. And Elena moved at the front, every nerve sharpened, every breath measured, her night vision goggles painting the terrain in green specters, walls rising ahead like jagged teeth in the moonlight, and she crouched low, signaling her breachers forward, her gloved hands slicing the air with commands precise and silent, and the men moved with her, their weapons glinting like predators' eyes, until they reached the first gate where charges were planted with careful hands, wires checked twice, timers set, and then with a soft click and a low rumble the entry point gave way, stone and dust blooming outward, and before the echoes faded Elena surged forward, weapon raised, her team fanning into formation as they swept the first courtyard. Silence shattered by muffled gunfire as guards stumbled half awake from their posts, only to fall before they could cry out. And in that first chaotic breath of violence the mission's rhythm was born, a pulse of deadly precision that carried them deeper into the compound, room after room cleared with ruthless speed, her voice steady in their ears as she directed angles and movements, her commands never faltering, and though adrenaline surged in her veins like fire, she controlled it, channeling it into cold focus, because the truth the reinforced doors where the 15 commanders were believed to be meeting, and every second that passed increased the risk of discovery, so she pushed harder, faster, leading the charge down narrow corridors where shadows twisted like living things, until finally they reached the inner chamber, its door heavy with steel, its hinges designed to resist, but Elena had anticipated this, and with a nod she gave the order, explosives set against the lock, a silent count ticking in their minds until the blast tore it open with a thunderclap that rattled the compound's bones, and in that instant chaos erupted, voices shouting in foreign tongues, weapons clattering, boots pounding across stone floors, and Elena was the first through the smoke, her rifle barking fire as shapes rose from the haze, enemy leaders grabbing weapons, scrambling for cover, but they had no time, no chance, because Elena's fury was faster, her precision deadly, into the dust, and her team followed like a storm behind her, bullets cutting through the air, grenades rolling into corners, screams echoing as enemies fell one after another, yet Elena never lost sight of the mission's heart, moving like a phantom from target to target, her eyes blazing with the certainty that failure was not an option, her every shot measured, her every command dragging the team deeper into victory, and though the room was a storm of fire and blood, she carved order out of chaos, until one by one the enemy commanders collapsed, their power extinguished beneath the relentless strike of a woman once doubted by those who now followed her without question, and as the 5th, the 6th, the 7th man fell, the tide shifted, fear dawning in the eyes of the survivors who realized too late that they had underestimated the rats sent against them, and Elena pressed harder, her breath steady even as sweat trickled beneath her. And when the 15th man collapsed into silence, the chamber echoed with the ringing aftermath of destruction, smoke hanging like a curtain over bodies strewn across stone, and in the stunned quiet that followed, her men stared, their disbelief giving way to awe. For what had seemed impossible only minutes before had unfolded before their eyes in brutal clarity, 15 enemies fallen in less than 5 minutes under the command of the woman they had once doubted, and though no one spoke, the weight of what had happened pressed into them all, carving a memory that would live long after the smoke cleared, and as Elena stood in the ruins, chest rising with controlled breaths, weapons still ready, she knew the mission was not over, escape still ahead, but in that instant, a new kind of silence filled her team, not doubt, not skepticism, but respect, forged in fire and sealed in blood. The silence inside the chamber did not last long, not a hollow shell but a living beast, and with the fall of its heart, the body began to stir violently, footsteps thundered from corridors, shouts rang out in alarm, and distant gunfire cracked as guards outside realized something terrible had happened. Yet Elena remained unshaken, her senses razor sharp, her mind already 3 steps ahead, and with a swift motion of her hand she ordered her team to regroup, to form a defensive perimeter as she called out coordinates for extraction, her voice calm even as chaos surged around them, because she knew panic was as deadly as bullets and her men would mirror her composure, so they steadied their grips, checked their sectors and prepared for the storm that was rushing toward them, and it came fast, fighters pouring into the hallways there. Weapons flashing, their voices a chorus of rage, but Elena's team held the line, unleashing controlled bursts of fire that cut down the first wave before it could breach the chamber, the walls shaking with the violence of battle, dust raining from the ceiling, air thick with smoke and screams, yet through it all Elena moved like a conductor among instruments of war, directing arcs of fire, shifting men to cover, spotting threats through the haze and eliminating them with unerring shots, and though the enemy came in numbers, they lacked the discipline and precision of her team, so they fell in clusters, each attempt to break through met with merciless response. And still Elena thought not only of surviving but of extracting, because killing 15 commanders meant nothing if her team was buried here, so she guided them toward the northern hall, the route she had chosen as the cleanest exit, though even now it crawled with enemies pouring in like a flood, and so the retreat became a moving battle, every step bought with bullets and grenades, every corner cleared in blood, and as they pushed forward Elena led from the front, never asking her men to face what she would not, her weapon spitting fire, her body driving carried her onward, and when a sudden explosion rocked the passage, shrapnel tearing through the walls, one of her men went down, clutching his leg as blood poured, and for a breath the momentum faltered. But Elena did not hesitate, she dropped beside him, dragging him behind cover with a strength that seemed impossible for her frame, her voice firm as she ordered another to patch him while she covered their flank, and when the enemy surged again she met them head-on, cutting them down with brutal efficiency until the hall was littered with bodies and her team was moving once more, their wounded carried but not abandoned, because she had sworn that none of them would be left behind, and that promise burned in her chest as fiercely as any mission order, and though the compound roared with reinforcements, though the enemy seemed endless, Elena's mind never cracked, every move calculated, every risk measured, and her men felt it, their fear tempered into courage by the certainty of her leadership, and together they carved a bloody path through the labyrinth, reaching finally the outer wall where the desert air hit their faces like a breath of freedom. Yet freedom was still distant. For searchlights now cut through the night, trucks roared to life, and fighters swarmed the perimeter with heavy weapons, rockets streaking overhead as the ground shook beneath the onslaught, and for a heartbeat some of the men thought this was where it would end, trapped in open ground under a sky on fire, but Elena saw opportunity where others saw doom, her eyes flicking to the ridge beyond the compound, a rise of stone and sand that could shield them until the birds arrived for extraction. And without hesitation she signaled the direction, rallying her team into motion, leading them across open ground as bullets sliced the air, sparks leaping from armor and walls exploding behind them, yet they did not falter, their legs pumping, their breaths ragged, every ounce of strength poured into that desperate sprint, and Elena was there at the her carrying over the chaos like a lifeline, until they crashed against the ridge. Tumbling into its shadows, hearts pounding, chests heaving, yet alive, and as they crouched there, weapons ready, the enemy encircling, Elena keyed her radio, her voice steady as she called for immediate extraction, giving coordinates through the static, her words clipped and precise, no trace of fear, and though the reply crackled with the promise of a 10-minute wait, 10 minutes that in battle felt like a lifetime, she did not let despair touch her men, she looked into their eyes through the night vision glow and told them simply, "We hold here." And with that she dug her boots into the earth, raised her weapon, and prepared for the longest 10 minutes of her life, because she knew the enemy would come with everything they had, and she also knew that if they broke now, everything they had achieved, the impossible victory, would vanish into the sands, so she anchored herself like stone, her presence alone steadying those around her, and when the enemy came, waves of them charging across the desert, shouting, firing, hurling grenades, her team fought with a ferocity born not of duty alone but of faith in the one leading them, and side by side they unleashed devastation, their weapons glowing hot, their arms aching, their lungs burning, but none relented because Elena was still there, still fighting, still unbroken, and with every enemy that fell, with every second that ticked away, hope grew stronger, until the thunder of rotors rose in the distance, a sound like salvation, and when the helicopters swept in, their floodlights tearing the night apart, Elena gave the order to move, covering her men as they dashed for the ropes, lifting the wounded first, ensuring each soul was aboard before she herself sprinted the final stretch, bullets chasing her heels, sand exploding at her feet, and with one last leap she caught the rope, hauling herself upward as tracers streaked past, her muscles screaming but refusing to fail, and then she was inside, pulled by her men who now looked at her not with doubt but with reverence, and as the helicopter lifted into the night, leaving the compound burning below and the enemy fading into dust, the reality of what they had done settled over them like a storm passing, 15 enemies slain in minutes, hundreds more held at bay, and not a single man abandoned, and though no medals gleamed yet, no headlines screamed her name, Elena knew in that quiet of the bird's cabin that she had changed more than the course of one mission, she had shattered every doubt, every whispered disbelief, and in the silence of exhausted men staring at her with something close to awe, she understood that this night had forged not only victory but legend. The helicopter's cabin rattled as it sped across the night sky, the rotors pounding a rhythm that matched the thunder of adrenaline still coursing through every vein in the squad, and though exhaustion weighed heavily on them, no one spoke for several long minutes, their silence filled only with labored breaths and the distant crackle of the radio, but in that silence each man wrestled with the storm of emotions inside him, relief at being alive, disbelief at what they had achieved, and a dawning realization that their doubts about Elena had died on the sands of that compound alongside the enemies they had slain. Yet Elena herself sat at the edge of the cabin, visor pushed back, rifle resting across her knees, her eyes fixed on the darkness rushing beneath them, her expression calm but her mind a battlefield of memories replaying every second of the mission, every shot fired, every order given, every scream of pain and burst of fire, because she knew victory was never just triumph but also a ledger of the fallen, even if those fallen were enemies, and though she had hardened herself long ago against the paralyzing grip of remorse, she still felt the weight of every life taken, not as just as it had since her first mission, carving lines of steel into her soul that no one could see, but as she glanced across the cabin at the wounded man, whose leg had been torn by shrapnel and now sat with his head leaning against the metal wall, pale but alive, she knew the choices she had made were the right ones, because his survival meant that her decisions, her risks, her refusal to abandon anyone, had saved not only him but the faith of the entire team, and when his tired eyes met hers, gratitude unspoken but heavy in the air, she offered only the faintest nod, because in war there were no speeches, no grand gestures, only the quiet acknowledgement between those who had survived hell together, and that was enough. Yet even as she allowed herself that moment, her mind pushed forward, because survival in combat was never the end. There would be debriefings, reports, superiors who would scrutinize every detail, and political strings pulled in offices from the battlefield, people who would twist victories and failures into narratives that suited them, but none of that mattered to her as much as the men she had led, the mission they had completed, and the message that now echoed in the hearts of those who had once doubted her, that leadership was not about gender, tradition, or expectation. It was about the steel to carry lives through fire and the wisdom to never falter when others looked to you for direction. And though Elena had always known that, tonight her team had learned it too, carved in blood and fire so deep it could never be erased. Yet she also knew this victory would draw new storms, enemies enraged by the loss of their commanders, networks scrambling to fill the void, missions even deadlier to come, because war never ended with one success, it only shifted and grew, and she was prepared for that. She had lived long enough in the crucible of combat to understand that one night of glory could lead to a lifetime of battles. But as the helicopter descended toward the safe zone, lights glimmering faintly in the distance, she allowed herself a single deep breath, a single moment of stillness to acknowledge that what they had done tonight was not ordinary, not routine, it was something extraordinary, the kind of mission whispered about in future briefings, the kind that turned into stories told to new recruits as warnings and inspiration. And as her boots hit the ground again, the desert wind rushing past her face, she braced herself for the line of officers waiting, faces grim, some expectant, some skeptical even still, but when her men stepped off behind her, battered, yet unbroken, carrying their wounded but with eyes burning with pride, she saw the shift ripple through the onlookers, a subtle change in posture, a flicker of respect too long withheld, and though the commanders would not say it aloud in that moment, though politics and pride would make them measure their words, Elena knew they had seen the undeniable truth reflected in the faces of those who had followed her through fire. Not succeeded but had led that no one could question, and later, when the debriefing stretched into hours, when every move was dissected and every casualty of the enemy catalogued, she answered with clarity, no embellishment, no dramatization, just cold precision, because she did not need to prove herself with words. Her actions had already spoken louder than anything she could say, and the men who had once smirked behind her back now sat in silence, listening. Their skepticism turned to reluctant admiration, and though she accepted their shifting gazes without satisfaction, she could not deny the ember of vindication glowing quietly inside her, because she had fought not only against an enemy outside but against disbelief within her own ranks, and she had won both battles in one night. Yet even as she sat there, body aching, mind replaying the chaos, she reminded herself that this was not the end of her proving. There would always be another challenge, another voice ready to question, another mission waiting to break them. And she welcomed it because she had built herself for storms, for proving again and again that the limits others placed on her were illusions. And when the briefing finally ended and she stepped out into the cool desert dawn, the first light spilling across the horizon like blood and gold, she let the quiet wash over her, the hum of the bass fading into the distance as she stood alone for a moment, helmet under her arm, eyes on the rising sun, knowing that tonight's story was already becoming legend among her men, and legends were never about perfection, they were about endurance, courage, and the refusal to bend under doubt. And as the wind swept the sand across her boots, Elena Hayes, once doubted by every commander who now whispered her name with respect, walked back toward her barracks not with pride but with resolve, because she knew the war would call again, and when it did she would answer, stronger than before, ready once more to carve order out of chaos and to prove, again and again, that doubt was nothing against the fire of determination. The days following, the mission passed in a blur of routine that felt both suffocating and strangely hollow, for though Elena and her team had returned as victors, the rhythm of military life did not allow them to bask in triumph for long. Reports had to be written, equipment checked, wounds treated, and drills resumed as though the night of fire and death had been just another operation. Yet beneath that surface of discipline something had shifted, not only within the men who had followed her but across the entire base. Whispers circulating through the halls, mess tents, and training yards about the woman who had led a SEAL team into the jaws of an impossible mission and returned with all her men alive, whispers that grew louder each day until even the most skeptical officers carried themselves differently in her presence, no longer with veiled disdain but with the wary acknowledgement one gives to a storm too powerful to deny, and though Elena did not seek that recognition, she could feel its weight, could sense the eyes that followed her, measuring her, some with admiration, some with envy, some with the quiet resentment of men who had built their lives on traditions now shattered by her existence. But she did not let their gazes distract her, because her focus remained fixed where it had always been, on readiness, on the men she led, on the missions yet to come, and in the weeks that followed, as intelligence reports flowed in of enemy networks splintering in disarray after the loss of their 15 commanders, new orders began to form, new targets marked, and Elena found herself once more in endless strategy sessions. Maps and satellite images spread before her, senior commanders asking for her insights, her analysis, her leadership, as though overnight the woman once doubted had become indispensable. Yet even as they leaned on her skill, they struggled to reconcile it with their old prejudices, and Elena could see it in the way their voices hesitated. Respect had replaced doubt, and she almost pitied them, for change was never easy, not even for warriors, but pity had no place in her heart, only clarity, and clarity told her that victories in war were temporary, that the enemy would not remain broken, that retaliation was already being plotted, and so she trained harder, pushed her men deeper into drills, refused to let them grow complacent on the laurels of their last mission, and, though some grumbled at the relentless pace, none disobeyed, for the memory of what she had led them through was still raw in their bones, and their respect for her was no longer tentative but forged. So they followed, even into exhaustion, because they understood she demanded from them only what she demanded from herself, and that bond was stronger than orders, it was trust. And trust was what would carry them through the fire again when the call came, and the call did come, sooner than any of them had expected, an urgent briefing delivered in the cold hours before dawn, intelligence reporting that a convoy of high-value targets was moving across hostile terrain, heavily guarded but vulnerable if struck with speed and precision. And though the mission bore none of the grandeur of storming a fortified compound, Elena knew its stakes were just as high, for the convoy carried not only insurgent leaders but also encrypted communications equipment that could expose entire networks if captured, and once again the responsibility was placed in her hands, not with doubt this time but with a quiet expectation that she would succeed where others might fail, and as she gathered her team, laying out the plan with her usual clarity, she saw in their eyes not the skepticism that had once haunted her but a fire that mirrored her own, a readiness born not from orders but from belief, and when they set out into the desert once more, riding low in armored vehicles that cut through the sands beneath a pale moon, Elena felt the transformation of fear into fuel, the knowledge that every decision she made would ripple through lives, and she embraced it, because she had long accepted that leadership was not about glory but about bearing the crushing weight of responsibility so others could move with certainty. And as they approached the convoy's projected path, engines humming, night vision scopes scanning the horizon, she signaled the halt, studied the terrain, and adjusted her plan on the fly, recognizing subtle changes in the enemy's movement that could have spelled disaster if ignored. And when the moment came, when the first enemy trucks rolled into the kill zone, her hand rose and dropped with precision, unleashing a coordinated strike of explosives, gunfire, and smoke that turned the quiet desert night into an inferno. And though the convoy fought back with ferocity, pouring out guards with heavy weapons, Elena's team moved with deadly grace, sweeping through the chaos with the same discipline that had carried the compound, their movements sharp, their aim unerring, and Elena herself was at the center, her weapon cutting down threats as she shouted orders through the storm, her mind balancing 10 variables at once. The angles of fire, the placement of her men, the shifting tide of enemies, and in the midst of it all she pushed forward toward the vehicles carrying the encrypted equipment, her heart pounding not with fear but with determination, because she knew the success of this mission would not only weaken the enemy further but protect countless lives across battlefields she might never see. And when at last the convoy lay in ruins, the equipment secured, and her men regrouped around her, sweat-drenched but alive, the desert once more echoing with the silence after chaos, she allowed herself a single long breath, a single moment to meet their eyes, to see in them again that same unspoken still the end, but only the continuation. And though her body bore the bruises of battle and her soul the scars of every life taken and every doubt endured, she felt stronger than ever, because each mission, each trial, each impossible challenge overcome was proof not only to the world but to herself that she was exactly where she belonged, at the front, leading through the storm. The victory over the convoy only deepened the legend that was beginning to take shape around Elena Hayes, though she herself resisted the word, for legend sounded like myth, like something detached from flesh and bone, and she knew too well the price of every mission, the sweat, the blood, the trembling exhaustion that came after the last shot was fired. Yet in the mess hall, in the barracks, in the hushed corners of command, her name was spoken with a new gravity, whispered among the young recruits like a beacon, discussed among the veterans as if she were a storm they had never expected to see. And while she bore it with the same stoic discipline she had always carried, her men noticed the shift, noticed how commanders who had once dismissed her now asked her for tactical evaluations, how intelligence officers lingered longer during her briefings, how the chain of command bent ever so slightly to make space for the weight she brought into a room. And though pride might have swelled in another, Elena felt only the tightening of responsibility, because she understood that the higher the pedestal, the sharper the knives waiting for failure, and war was a cruel place where even the strongest leaders could fall in an instant. So she buried herself in preparation, drilling her men with relentless intensity, expanding their endurance, sharpening their reflexes, testing them with night exercises until they collapsed, and then pushing them to rise again, because she knew the enemy was watching, regrouping, and sooner or later they would strike not with scattered fury but with calculated vengeance, and she would not allow her when she sat alone in her quarters, the room dark save for the glow of a single lamp, staring at the reports of those who had died by her command, the faces of enemies and the brief notes about their crimes, and though she felt no regret for eliminating them, she could not erase the weight of knowing she had ended lives, and she let that weight sit with her, because ignoring it would have been weakness, and she had long ago sworn never to hide from the cost of her choices, but rather to carry them until her last breath, for that was what true leadership meant, not glory but burden, not praise but endurance, and she bore it in silence, telling no one, because silence was her way of protecting her men from the darker edges of command. Yet even as she wrestled with the solitude of leadership, the world beyond the desert began to take notice. Reports of her mission circulated beyond the walls of the base, stories filtered through military channels, and soon articles whispered their leading operations no one else dared, though official recognition remained buried under layers of secrecy. And while the public would never know her name, within the hidden war she had become a force that enemies feared, her presence rumored even where she had never set foot, insurgents whispering about the woman who had brought down 15 leaders in minutes, their fear becoming as useful a weapon as her rifle. And as new missions came, each more dangerous than the last, Elena led with the same unshaken resolve, storming safe houses, dismantling networks, rescuing captives, each success adding to the growing weight of her legend. Yet she never allowed her men to grow complacent, reminding them again and again that past victories meant nothing in the face of tomorrow's battles, and they believed her, followed her without hesitation, because they had seen with their own eyes what she was capable of, and that bond carried them through the fire again and again, until one night when the storm they had all been waiting for finally broke, intelligence reporting that the fractured enemy had united under a single surviving general, a man ruthless and cunning, who had sworn to annihilate Elena and her team, gathering hundreds of fighters, building traps, laying ambushes, preparing to crush the very unit that had humiliated them. And when the orders came for Elena to lead a mission into the heart of this renewed force, even the commanders who now respected her shifted uneasily, for they knew this was no simple strike, this was war condensed into a single operation, and the chance of survival slim. Yet Elena accepted without hesitation, her voice calm as ever as she told her men, "We've faced worse odds before," and though her words were simple, the memory of the compound, the convoy, the countless nights of training rose in their minds, and they believed her, and so they prepared, loading gear, checking weapons, tightening bonds of trust forged in blood, and as they set out into the night once more, the desert stretched them vast and merciless. But Elena's gaze never wavered, her mind already charting the storm they were about to enter, because she knew that leadership was not about the odds, it was about standing when others faltered, about carrying the fire even into the jaws of death. And if this was to be their greatest trial, she would meet it head-on, unflinching, because she had built her life for moments exactly like this. The operation to confront the enemy general began under a moonless sky. The desert stretched vast and black as if the world itself had been swallowed by silence. And in that silence Elena led her team forward, their boots sinking into the cold sand, their breath masked behind gear, their weapons gleaming faintly under the starlight, and though each man carried his own fears, they carried them with the steadiness of veterans who had walked through fire before, and at their center was Elena, her presence grounding them like a mountain in the middle of a storm, her eyes fixed ahead as she reviewed the plan once more in her mind, the aerial scans, the heat signatures, the intelligence reports that painted a picture of an enemy force far larger than theirs, yet spread out in patterns she could exploit, because Elena knew victory in war was never about numbers. It was about precision, about striking where the enemy was weakest, about moving faster than they could react. And as they approached the canyon where the enemy had fortified their camp, the faint glow of fires flickering against stone walls, she raised her hand and the entire unit froze, dropping low, scanning, listening, and in that instant she felt the hum of danger vibrating through the air, the instinct born of countless missions whispering that the enemy was waiting, that this was not just a camp but a trap. And though another leader might have pulled back, might have reconsidered, Elena did not hesitate. She recalibrated, her mind shifting like gears, recognizing the ambush points along the ridges, the paths where snipers would lie in wait, and she adjusted the plan in seconds, whispering into comms new directions, rerouting squads into flanking arcs, setting charges in the sand behind them as fail-safes, every decision sharp and decisive, and her men obeyed without question. Their trust in her now absolute, and then with a silent signal, they moved, sliding into the canyon like shadows, the first shots cracking almost immediately, muzzle flashes lighting the night as enemy fighters opened fire from hidden nests. But Elena's preparation turned the ambush into their own trap, her men responding with devastating precision, grenades arcing into the ridges, silenced rifles picking off snipers, charges detonating behind to collapse pathways and cut off reinforcements. The canyon erupting into chaos that the enemy had meant to control but which now spiraled beyond them, and through the smoke and dust Elena pressed forward, leading from the front as always, her weapon a constant flash of fire, her voice into dominance, and the men drew strength from her unshakable will, pushing deeper, fighting harder, until the canyon floor ran thick with the debris of battle. Yet even as they advanced, the true test lay ahead for the enemy. General had not shown himself, his presence still hidden within the heart of the encampment, guarded by his most loyal fighters, men fanatical enough to die before letting him fall, and Elena knew that reaching him would require more than firepower, it would require nerve, timing, and the kind of relentless drive that refused to stop even when the world itself seemed to resist. And so she gathered her team at the edge of the inner camp, their breaths ragged, their ammo packs lighter, their bodies marked by close calls and narrow escapes, and she looked at them through the haze of smoke, her words few but heavy, "We finish this," and in those 3 words she bound them together tighter than any speech could, and they surged forward with her, breaching the heart of the camp, a storm of steel and fire tearing through barracks and bunkers, the defenders fighting with desperation, screaming war cries, unleashing rockets and mortars that shook the ground, but Elena moved through it all. With a calm ferocity, directing squads, cutting down threats, dragging a wounded man out of the line of fire with one arm while firing with the other, her determination unbreakable, until at last they reached the command tent, a massive structure of steel and canvas fortified with sandbags, and there he was, the general, a towering figure with eyes like burning coals, barking orders, firing his weapon, rallying his men with a ferocity that marked him as no ordinary leader. And when Elena's gaze locked with his through the chaos, the battlefield seemed to narrow, the noise dimming, the distance between them collapsing into inevitability, and she pressed forward, carving a path through his guards, her rifle spitting fire, her knife flashing in close quarters, until she stood before him, the 2 forces of will colliding in a storm of violence, bullets screaming past, dust rising, their soldiers clashing around them, and the general charged, his strength immense, striking with the force of a hammer. But Elena was faster, her training sharper, her instincts honed, and though the clash was brutal, though each blow rattled her bones, she refused to give an inch, her resolve harder than steel, and in the end, with a final strike, she brought him down, the weight of his fall echoing through the camp like the collapse of a mountain, and in that instant the enemy's spirit broke, fighters who had sworn to fight to the death faltering, scattering, their resolve crumbling as they saw their leader defeated, and Elena raised her weapon high, signaling her men, her voice cutting through the chaos with the command to push, to finish, and they did, sweeping through the remnants of resistance until the camp lay silent save for the crackle of flames and the distant wail of the wounded, and as the last battle faded into the night, Elena stood over the fallen general, her chest heaving, her body aching, her armor scorched, but her eyes steady, and around her, her men gathered, battered but alive, their gazes fixed on her with awe that words could not capture, for they had not only survived the impossible, they had conquered it, and they knew with absolute certainty that it was because of her unyielding will, her unbreakable resolve, her refusal to bow to doubt or fear, and in that silence, in the stillness after the storm, Elena Hayes became not just their commander but their legend, etched forever in the blood and fire of that night. The aftermath of the battle lingered in the canyon like the echo of a nightmare, the smoke curling into the starlit sky, the sand stained dark where blood had soaked deep, and though victory was there, fire steel, for Elena and her ammunition nearly spent, their nerves stretched to the edge, yet in the silence that followed, as the crackling flames gnawed at the wreckage of the enemy's camp, they understood they had not just defeated an army, they had broken the spine of a force that had haunted the region for years, and though Elena allowed herself no outward display of emotion, inside her chest her heart beat with the heavy rhythm of finality, because she knew this victory would ripple outward like shockwaves, toppling networks, scattering fighters, leaving their enemies adrift without direction. But she also knew it came at a cost, every man carrying wounds, some visible, some buried deep, and she felt the weight of those wounds like they were her own, for leadership had never been about glory to her, it had always been about burden, about carrying the unseen scars of every choice, every sacrifice, and as dawn painted the desert horizon in streaks of firing, her voice steady over comms though her throat burned with exhaustion, and when the helicopters arrived, their rotors sending dust into swirling halos, the men climbed aboard with the slow heaviness of survivors who had given everything, and as Elena pulled herself into the cabin, her armor scorched, her muscles trembling, her eyes scanning each of her men to ensure none were left behind, she allowed herself a single long breath, not of relief but of resolve, because she knew even now the war was not over, it never would be, but they had carved a victory so decisive that it would echo far beyond this desert, and when they landed at base hours later, the scene that met them was unlike anything they had experienced before, rows of soldiers and officers standing in silence as Elena and her team disembarked, their faces solemn, their eyes carrying something between respect and awe, and though no medals were pinned, no speeches made, the silence itself was louder than it could not capture, and as Elena walked past them, her men following, the air seemed to shift, heavy with recognition, and in that moment the doubts that had once clung to her name were gone, erased by fire and blood, replaced by an unspoken reverence that even the most hardened skeptics could not deny, yet Elena herself did not walk with pride but with the same steady composure she had always carried, because she knew respect was not the end goal, survival was not the final chapter, the war would continue, missions would come, enemies would rise, and she would need to lead again and again, and so she did not let herself be consumed by the whispers of legend now swirling around her, but instead returned to her routines, to her training, to her men, because she understood that leadership was not a single moment but an endless line of choices, and she would keep making them until her body could no longer carry the weight. Yet in quiet moments, when she found herself alone in the desert sky, she allowed herself to think of what had been achieved, to remember the night when 15 enemies fell in 5 minutes, the night when a canyon erupted into fire and a general was brought down, the nights when her men looked at her not with doubt but with faith, and she realized those moments were not about her alone but about all of them, about the bond they had forged, the unbreakable trust that had turned impossible missions into victories, and though history might one day forget their names, though official reports might bury their deeds under the veil of secrecy, she knew that what mattered was not recognition but the lives saved, the networks dismantled, the storms weathered, and that truth was enough for her, so she stood ready, always ready, because war would call again, and when it did, Elena Hayes would answer as she always had, with fire in her veins, steel in her spine, and the unyielding certainty that no doubt, no fear, no enemy could ever break her, for she had been doubted and tested and had answered with resilience, and now she stood not only as a commander but as a legend carried in the hearts of those who had fought beside her. A legend forged not by stories told but by blood spilled, by choices made, by courage unrelenting, and though she would never call herself a hero, those who followed her knew the truth, that in the darkest nights, when the world seemed to break, she was the one who stood unbroken, and that was enough to change everything. The end.